In a recent interview, Quentin Tarantino made some eye-catching remarks about Michael Mann's filmography. Specifically, he noted that Mann's films only work when he is dealing with the 20th century and that Mann's strengths shine most in crime stories. Tarantino added an exception for The Insider, 1999, which, while not strictly a crime film, takes on the energy and feel of one. Tarantino's comments, while pointed, do not seem to come from a place of malice, but rather reflect his own nuanced perspective on what makes Mann's work successful. Tarantino stated in a recent podcast, "Michael Mann's movies only work when he is dealing with the 20th century. I think there is particularly something about Mann doing crime stories. I think there is something a little lost when he is not doing a crime story, with the exception of The Insider, 1999, which they try to make as much like a crime story as they possibly can. But does this mean that Mann's work outside the 20th century is subpar? Not necessarily. It could simply mean that Mann's visual and thematic storytelling is most at home in a world that hasn't fully transitioned to the virtual, where human tensions and conflicts feel more immediate and unfiltered. Tarantino, who himself revels in 20th century nostalgia, might feel Mann is straying from his sweet spot when his films are set in a more modern context. Tarantino's second key point focuses on Mann's expertise with crime stories. From Heat to Collateral, 2004, Mann has repeatedly returned to the underworld of criminals and law enforcers, rendering them with a level of psychological depth and stylistic flourish that few other filmmakers have achieved. Tarantino's acknowledgement of Mann's exceptional work in this genre seems less of a critique and more of a recognition of a cinematic niche where Mann truly excels. Mann's crime films are a unique blend of character study and action, where the lines between good and evil blur, and Tarantino's comments suggest that this complexity is where Mann's films feel most alive. One could argue that crime stories provide Mann with the perfect narrative canvas to explore larger themes of honor, betrayal, and the human condition. Tarantino's exception to his crime story rule is The Insider, 1999, a film about corporate whistleblowing and the tobacco industry. While not a traditional crime film, The Insider plays out with the tension, stakes, and pacing of one. Mann and screenwriter Eric Roth frame Jeffrey Wigand's legal battle against corporate behemoths like a high-stakes thriller. The protagonists may not be wielding guns, but the conflict feels just as dangerous. For Tarantino, this film succeeds because it mimics the structure of a crime story, further reinforcing the idea that Mann's narrative strengths lie in high-stakes confrontations, whether criminal or corporate. The question remains, does Tarantino's assertion about Mann's limitations hold water? To a degree, it's a subjective take, one rooted in Tarantino's own sensibilities as a filmmaker who is deeply in love with genre and era specificity. Michael Mann's body of work, which extends beyond crime dramas and the 20th century, includes films like Ali, 2001, a biopic about Muhammad Ali, and Black Hat, 2015, a cybercrime thriller set in a globalized world. These films, while skillfully crafted, didn't receive the same level of cultural impact or critical acclaim as Mann's crime-focused projects. It is worth considering that Mann's more modern films struggle not because of his incapability, but because they move away from the gritty, street-level tension that defined his earlier works. In this sense, Tarantino may be onto something when he suggests that Mann's storytelling loses a bit of its edge when it diverges from the crime genre or the 20th century settings where those stories unfold naturally. Quentin Tarantino's comments on Michael Mann's films are less an outright dismissal and more of a personal reflection on where Mann's filmmaking excels. By highlighting Mann's successes in the crime genre and the 20th century, Tarantino isn't trashing Mann as much as acknowledging where his strengths lie. As a filmmaker deeply in tune with genre, style, and era, Tarantino seems to feel that Mann's mastery is in capturing the grit, complexity, and human drama that comes with crime stories, especially those rooted in the tactile, analog world of the last century. Whether or not one agrees with this assessment, Tarantino's comments spark a deeper conversation about the intersections of style, genre, and historical setting in filmmaking.